There is a strange truth about love that most people never stop to examine. We tend to believe that connection deepens the moment someone sees our best qualities, our charm, our accomplishments, our confidence, or the polished image we have carefully learned to present. We imagine that affection grows because we have successfully impressed another person, because we appeared interesting enough, attractive enough, intelligent enough, or emotionally composed enough to earn a place in their life. From childhood onward, many people quietly absorb the idea that love is something achieved through performance. If we can simply become better, stronger, more successful, more desirable, then surely connection will follow. But if you look closely at how real bonds actually form, you notice something almost the opposite is true. The relationships that leave the deepest mark rarely begin with perfection. They begin with humanity. They begin in those unexpected moments when the carefully rehearsed version of ourselves grows tired, slips away, or simply becomes impossible to maintain. It is often then, rather than before, that something genuine has the opportunity to emerge. Not when someone admires the version of you that you present to the world, but when they finally meet the version of you that exists underneath it. The self beneath the performance is rarely flawless. It carries uncertainty alongside confidence. It contains old disappointments, quiet fears, private dreams, contradictions, and unanswered questions. It is the part that sometimes doubts itself after appearing certain. It is the voice that longs to be understood without constantly explaining itself. It is the inner world that exists long before anyone else arrives and continues existing long after everyone leaves. Most people spend years protecting this hidden self. They learn which emotions receive approval and which ones invite rejection. They discover that confidence is often rewarded while vulnerability feels dangerous. They become experts at appearing capable, composed, and emotionally independent, even during moments when they feel anything but. The result is a carefully constructed identity that functions almost like armor. It protects against disappointment, but it also quietly prevents genuine intimacy from taking root. This is one of the great paradoxes of human connection. The very walls built to prevent rejection often become the same walls that prevent closeness. Psychologically, this makes profound sense. Human beings are not designed to attach merely to appearances. We are wired to respond to authenticity because authenticity signals trust. When another person allows us to see their imperfections without disguising every weakness, they communicate something far more powerful than confidence alone. They communicate safety. They say without words, "This is who I am when I stop trying to convince you." That kind of honesty creates an entirely different emotional atmosphere. Instead of wondering whether every conversation is another performance, both people begin relaxing into reality. Laughter becomes less calculated, silence becomes less uncomfortable, disagreements become opportunities for understanding rather than evidence that everything is falling apart. There is less energy spent maintaining an image and more energy available for actually experiencing one another. This explains why some conversations remain unforgettable despite being completely ordinary on the surface. Nothing spectacular happened. No dramatic declarations were made. There were no cinematic confessions, no carefully rehearsed speeches, no perfect sequence of words that could later be quoted as the turning point. If an outsider had been watching, they might have struggled to understand why those few minutes mattered at all. From the outside, it looked like two people talking. They spoke about work, childhood memories, music, the weather, family, books, small disappointments, forgotten dreams, or the strange events of an otherwise ordinary day. Yet somehow, each person walked away feeling lighter, calmer, and more understood than before. What made those moments meaningful was not the brilliance of the words, it was the absence of pretense. There is something profoundly disarming about being in the presence of someone who is no longer trying to impress you. It changes the emotional atmosphere almost immediately. The conversation no longer feels like an interview where both people are competing to appear interesting. It no longer resembles a performance in which every sentence is carefully measured for maximum approval. Instead, the exchange becomes something far more alive. Thoughts appear naturally. Silence is allowed to exist without becoming uncomfortable. Laughter arrives unexpectedly, not because someone planned to be entertaining, but because joy found enough room to enter the space between two people. Psychologically, this shift is significant. Much of our daily communication is shaped by invisible calculations. We wonder how we are being perceived. We edit our opinions before expressing them. We soften certain truths while exaggerating others. We unconsciously monitor facial expressions, searching for signs of approval or rejection. The mind becomes occupied with managing impressions rather than sharing experience. This process consumes enormous emotional energy. Imagine trying to hold a conversation while simultaneously standing in front of a mirror, constantly adjusting your posture, your expression, your tone, and every word that leaves your mouth. That is how many social interactions quietly unfold. Attention becomes divided between genuine connection and careful self-management. The result is often exhausting, even when the interaction appears pleasant. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine speaking with someone whose presence makes that invisible mirror disappear. Suddenly, attention returns to the conversation itself rather than to the image you are projecting. You stop wondering whether every sentence is impressive enough. You stop searching for the perfect response. Instead, you become curious. You begin listening rather than preparing your next statement. Your mind slows down because it no longer needs to defend itself every few seconds. This is why authenticity often feels strangely peaceful. It reduces psychological friction. The nervous system recognizes environments where vigilance is no longer necessary. Muscles relax almost imperceptibly. Breathing becomes steadier. Thoughts become less fragmented. The body begins responding to emotional safety before the conscious mind fully understands why. Long before logic explains the experience, the nervous system has already concluded that this person feels different. This is one reason why emotional safety can become more memorable than excitement. Excitement is stimulating, but safety is regulating. A conversation filled with dramatic emotion may be remembered because it overwhelmed the senses. A conversation filled with genuine acceptance is remembered because it quietly reorganized the emotional landscape. One creates intensity, the other creates peace. Human beings often underestimate the power of peace because it rarely announces itself. Drama demands attention. Calmness invites reflection. One leaves the heart racing, the other allows the heart to rest. That rest is surprisingly rare in modern relationships. Many interactions are filled with subtle competition. People compete to appear happier, wiser, funnier, more successful, more emotionally detached, or somehow more valuable than they actually feel inside. Even vulnerability sometimes becomes another performance, shared strategically rather than sincerely. But authentic conversations operate according to entirely different rules. Nobody is trying to win. Nobody is trying to dominate. Nobody is secretly measuring their worth against the other person. Instead, there is mutual curiosity. Questions arise because someone genuinely wants to understand, not because they are collecting information to strengthen an argument later. Listening becomes generous rather than transactional. Responses emerge from attention instead of anticipation. This changes the emotional texture of every sentence. Even pauses begin carrying meaning. Most people fear silence because they assume silence signals failure. They rush to fill every empty moment with additional words, jokes, explanations, or distractions. Yet among people who feel emotionally safe together, silence often becomes another language entirely. Two people can sit quietly without experiencing pressure to perform. The silence itself communicates acceptance. It says, nothing has gone wrong simply because no one is speaking. That kind of silence is deeply intimate because it removes one of the most persistent fears many people carry, the fear that their value depends upon constant performance. Carl Jung observed that much of human life is shaped by the persona, the social identity developed to meet the expectations of the surrounding world. The persona is not inherently false. It serves an important purpose. Society requires certain forms of politeness, competence, and self-control. Yet difficulties arise when people begin believing the persona is all they are allowed to be. If every interaction remains confined to that polished surface, genuine intimacy struggles to develop. The hidden parts of the personality never receive recognition. The fears remain hidden. The hopes remain hidden. The tenderness remains hidden. The uncertainties remain hidden. Two personas may interact successfully for years while the deeper individuals beneath them remain strangers. Authentic conversation gently reverses this process. Without dramatic intention, people begin revealing pieces of themselves that rarely appear elsewhere. Someone admits they still think about a childhood dream they abandoned. Someone laughs about an embarrassing mistake instead of hiding it. Someone acknowledges uncertainty without apologizing for it. Another shares a quiet hope for the future without fearing it will sound unrealistic. None of these moments appear extraordinary by themselves. Together, however, they create something remarkable. Each honest disclosure functions like another bridge placed across emotional distance. Trust rarely arrives in one dramatic leap. It accumulates through dozens of seemingly insignificant experiences. One truthful sentence, one patient response, one moment of understanding, another conversation, another shared silence. Gradually, two inner worlds begin recognizing each other. There is another fascinating psychological phenomenon at work here. People often remember less about the exact content of a conversation than they remember how they felt while having it. Specific words fade with time, stories become blurred, details disappear, yet the emotional atmosphere remains astonishingly vivid. Years later, someone may struggle to recall what was discussed that evening, but they remember feeling accepted. They remember laughing without restraint. They remember leaving with an unexpected sense of hope. They remember walking home feeling somehow more themselves than they had felt in months. This is because emotions organize memory more powerfully than information alone. Facts occupy the mind. Experiences settle into identity. A conversation that allows someone to feel genuinely understood does more than exchange ideas. It quietly reshapes how they experience themselves. Being seen without immediate correction or judgment creates an internal experience that many people rarely encounter. For a brief period, they no longer need to defend who they are. They simply exist in the presence of another human being who is willing to meet them without demanding that they become someone else first. Perhaps this is why those ordinary conversations continue echoing through memory long after their details disappear. Not because the words themselves were extraordinary, not because the setting was remarkable, not because destiny announced itself with unmistakable certainty, but because for a little while two people stepped out of the exhausting theater of performance and entered something far quieter, far rarer, and infinitely more transformative. A space where nothing needed to be proven, nothing needed to be hidden, and the simple act of being fully present became enough. In that quiet exchange, connection was no longer something either person had to earn. It simply revealed itself as though it had been patiently waiting beneath the surface all along. The philosopher Martin Buber once distinguished between relationships in which we relate to another as an object and those in which we encounter another as a genuine person. While the language differs, the underlying insight remains remarkably relevant. Real intimacy begins not when we admire someone's image, but when we encounter their inner reality with openness instead of judgment. This is also why emotional safety often feels more attractive than perfection. Perfection creates distance because it seems untouchable. It invites admiration, but not always closeness. Authenticity, however, invites participation. It quietly gives another person permission to lower their own defenses. One honest admission often leads to another. One vulnerable conversation becomes the beginning of trust. Before long, two people are no longer exchanging polished versions of themselves. They are slowly becoming witnesses to each other's inner worlds. That witnessing is transformative. To be truly seen is not simply to have someone notice your strengths. It is to have them recognize your contradictions without reducing you to them. It is to know that someone has observed your moments of uncertainty, your imperfections, your unfinished places, and still chooses to remain present. That experience satisfies one of the deepest psychological needs human beings possess, the desire not merely to be admired, but to be known. Carl Jung often suggested that much of human growth occurs when we stop identifying exclusively with the persona, the social mask we wear to meet the world's expectations, and begin integrating the neglected parts of ourselves. Healthy love often mirrors this process. It gently encourages us to step away from performance, not because perfection has become unnecessary, but because authenticity has become more valuable. Ironically, This is where attraction often deepens rather than fades. When someone no longer feels responsible for maintaining an impossible image, emotional energy begins flowing into curiosity, compassion, humor, and presence. Conversations become richer because neither person is constantly editing themselves. Affection grows stronger because it is attached to something real rather than something carefully manufactured. The relationship stops revolving around impressing one another and begins revolving around understanding one another. This is why the relationships that endure are rarely sustained by flawless appearances alone. Beauty changes, success rises and falls, confidence expands and contracts with the seasons of life. But the experience of being deeply understood has an extraordinary resilience. It becomes a quiet foundation that continues supporting two people even when circumstances become uncertain. In the end, lasting love is rarely built upon the moment someone discovers your brightest qualities. Those qualities may open the door, but they seldom build the home. The home is built later, in quieter moments, when both people realize they no longer have to perform to deserve each other's presence. They can simply arrive as they are, carrying both their light and their shadows, knowing that genuine connection was never waiting for perfection. It was waiting for the courage to become visible. There is a strange truth about love that most people never stop to examine. We tend to believe that connection deepens the moment someone sees our best qualities, our charm, our looks, our confidence. But if you look closely at how real bonds actually form, you notice something almost the opposite is true. The relationships that last, the ones that actually change us, tend to begin at the moment the performance stops. Not when someone admires the version of you that you present to the world, but when they finally meet the version of you that exists underneath it. I spent much of life studying this exact gap between the self we show and the self we are. He believed that when two people meet, they rarely meet each other directly. Instead, each person meets an image, a kind of mental sketch built out of hope, memory, longing, and unfinished business from their own past. We look at a new person and without meaning to, we hand them a script. We decide what their silence means. We decide what their distance means. We fill in the blanks with pieces of ourselves, our own fears, our own desires, our own unhealed places. And then we fall in love with the picture we've drawn, convinced it's simply who they are. This isn't dishonesty. It's just how the mind works when it meets uncertainty. Not knowing someone fully is uncomfortable, so the imagination rushes in to finish the picture. In the beginning, this feels wonderful. Everything seems to click. Every gesture seems meaningful. Every quiet moment seems to confirm the story you've already decided to believe. That's the pull of projection. It gives you the comfort of certainty long before you've earned any real understanding. But no illusion survives contact with time. Eventually, the sketch a person drew of you starts to conflict with who you actually are, and something has to give. Maybe they assumed your quietness meant you were closed off, and instead, they discover it was thoughtfulness. Maybe they assumed your independence meant you didn't need them, and instead they discover it was self-respect, something you built because no one else was going to build it for you. Maybe they mistook your calm for indifference, when really it took everything you had to stay calm through things they never even knew you were carrying. This is the moment Jung considered sacred, in a strange sort of way. Not because it feels good, but because it's honest. The moment illusion breaks is the moment two people have the chance to actually meet for the first time, even if they've known each other for years. And it rarely feels peaceful. It usually feels disorienting, even a little painful, because giving up an illusion means giving up the sense of control that came with it. You can't argue with a fantasy. Fantasies never surprise you, never contradict you, never ask anything of you. Real people do all three. So when someone finally sees you, not the edited version, not the highlight reel, but the actual person who stayed quiet through storms they never explained, who kept moving forward while carrying weight nobody offered to help with, it tends to hit them harder than they expect. They start replaying old memories with new eyes. A comment that once seemed cold now reads as guarded. A moment of distance that once felt like rejection now reads as someone protecting themselves the only way they knew how. Nothing about the past changes, but the meaning of it does, and that can feel like the ground shifting. Here's the part Jung came back to again and again, though. This reckoning was never really about you. Yes, they're seeing you clearly for the first time, but in doing that, They're also being forced to look at themselves, at the assumptions they made, the judgments they were quick to reach, the ways they mistook their own fear or insecurity for insight into your character. He talked about relationships as mirrors, and he meant it almost literally. We don't just encounter another person's soul. We encounter our own reactions to it, and those reactions tell us as much about our inner world as anything the other person ever said or did. Someone might realize they admired your strength because they've never quite trusted their own. They might notice your patience and feel uncomfortable because it puts a spotlight on how little patience they've had with themselves. They might understand for the first time that what unsettled them about you wasn't actually about you at all. It was about the parts of themselves they'd been avoiding. That's the part of connection nobody warns you about. Being truly seen by someone often means they end up seeing themselves too, and that can be uncomfortable for both people involved. None of this means your worth was ever in question, though, and this is the part worth holding on to. You didn't become valuable the moment someone finally noticed the truth about you. Your depth, your resilience, the quiet battles you fought without applause, all of that existed long before anyone else caught up to it. Someone else's dawning awareness doesn't create your worth. It only catches up to something that was already there the whole time. If anything, that's the most important distinction in this entire idea. Recognition doesn't manufacture value, it simply reveals it. Jung called the lifelong process of becoming your true self individuation, the slow, sometimes uncomfortable work of integrating every part of who you are instead of living only through the mask you present to others. Most people spend years, sometimes decades, shaping themselves around what they think will earn approval. They soften their opinions, hide the parts of themselves that might invite judgment, and slowly drift further from anything resembling their actual personality. It's exhausting, even if it doesn't always feel exhausting in the moment, because performance takes energy that authenticity never asks for. At some point, though, most people reach a wall. Pretending stops being sustainable. And the people who choose real connection over the comfort of the mask tend to notice something interesting. Authenticity has a kind of gravity that performance never manages to fake. You can imitate charm, you can manufacture attention, but you cannot manufacture the quiet, steady sense that someone is simply fully themselves. No auditioning, no chasing, no need for outside validation to feel secure in who they are. People feel that difference even when they can't quite explain why. This is often why authentic people leave such a lasting mark, even when they weren't trying to impress anyone at all. Their presence isn't loud, but it's honest, and honesty has a way of making other people quietly reconsider their own defenses. Someone who has spent years hiding behind a curated version of themselves might meet a person who isn't hiding at all, and something in them starts to loosen. They start questioning their own masks. They start wondering how much of their life has been built around fear of judgment instead of a real relationship with who they actually are. That's the strange gift hidden inside authenticity. It gives other people permission to stop performing too. Not because you demanded it, not because you set out to teach anyone a lesson, but simply because your presence didn't require the performance in the first place. Jung believed that kind of self-possession was never selfish. He argued it was the only foundation honest connection could actually be built on, because two people wearing masks can only ever have a relationship with each other's masks. Somebody has to be willing to be real first. None of this promises comfort, and it's worth being honest about that too. Choosing to live and love as your actual self, rather than the version people find easiest to approve of, sometimes means being misunderstood. It sometimes means standing alone for stretches of time while other people catch up or never catch up at all. Not everyone will have the patience or the self-awareness to move past their own projections and meet you where you actually are. That's not a failure on your part. It's simply the cost of refusing to shrink yourself into something more convenient for someone else's comfort. But for the people who do stay, who are willing to sit with the discomfort of letting an illusion break instead of clinging to it, something far more solid gets built in its place. Not a relationship held together by assumption and hope, but one built on the much harder, much rarer foundation of actually knowing each other. That kind of bond doesn't need constant reassurance because it isn't propped up by fantasy in the first place. It can hold weight. It can survive disagreement, distance, bad days, and long silences, because it was never dependent on a perfect image to begin with. So if someone in your life has recently started seeing you more clearly, really seeing you, past the assumptions they walked in with, and it seems to be shaking something loose in them, understand what that actually is. It isn't them falling out of love with who they thought you were. It's them finally arriving at who you actually are and discovering that the real version was steadier, deeper, and far more solid than the story they'd been telling themselves. That reckoning is uncomfortable because truth usually is at first, but it's also the only place real connection has ever been able to grow from. And whatever happens on their end of that process, remember that your task was never to manage someone else's realization. It was never your job to perform a version of yourself simple enough to be instantly understood, or to chase recognition from people who weren't ready to see you clearly yet. Your task, the only one that was ever really yours, was to keep becoming more honest with yourself, to keep choosing depth over performance, even when nobody was watching closely enough to notice the difference. Because the people who are meant to understand you will eventually catch up to what was true about you all along. And when they do, they won't be discovering someone extraordinary out of nowhere. They'll simply be discovering, finally, what was real the entire time.